Friends, good evening and welcome to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church and to tonight's McClendon Scholar in Residence program. I'm Reverend Dr. Sarah Johnson, the senior pastor at New York Avenue, and it is my joy and my privilege to welcome you tonight from wherever you are joining us, from the DMV area or for another part of the country or even across the globe. We are so glad to have you with us tonight. As many of you know, as you have participated likely previously in webinars and programs of the McClendon Scholar event, the McClendon Scholar program is to invite scholars and thought leaders to share their learning and wisdom and insight about how the church writ large can be more effective in its ministry and in its witness. Tonight's McClendon program is a wonderful opportunity to engage in just such a way as we welcome Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock. Dr. Brock has inspired many as a minister and a thought leader and a fine theologian and a scholar. I am particularly excited about tonight's program, and as a matter of personal and pastoral privilege, will share that I first became aware of Dr. Brock's work in moral injury several years ago when serving in Dallas, Texas, and she was serving as director of the Soul Repair Center at Bright Divinity School. But later, Rita's scholarship in atonement, particularly her writings on saving paradise, which I believe she will share with us on tonight's topic, as well as her book, Proverbs with Ashes, were incredibly significant to my study and thesis writing as a DMin student. And I'm just thrilled to have her and to learn from her again tonight. Very much look forward to all that she will have to share. And I know that you all who are here tonight feel the same. As we begin and open our time, let me open us with an invocation. So let us pray. God, the encourager, God, the compassionate, God, the merciful, creator of all, disturb us, rouse us from our sleep, lift us into the consciousness of your presence, change us, move us, mold us for the better, so that at the sound of your voice and the call of our name, we will never be the same. Amen.
Good evening. I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar featuring our McClendon Scholar for the summer, Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock. This is the first of 3 presentations that Dr. Brock will give this month and next, and her topic tonight is moral injury and climate change, reclaiming our love for the earth. I'll say a little bit more about our program, this program, and explain how it will work in just a moment. But before that, we want to take a minute or two to learn a little bit more about you who have tuned in tonight. We know that people from all over the United States attend our webinars, and we want to learn a little bit more about that. It helps us as we understand who tunes in and as we think about future programs. Therefore, I'd like to ask each of you to do 2 things. One of them, something that some of you are probably already doing, which is going to the chat function. You've not used the webinar before, it's generally at the bottom. It's different places on different computers. But you go to the chat function, not Q&A, we'll use that later, but go to the chat function and type in where it is that you are from, the community, and if you're with a particular congregation, maybe mention that also. But just take a moment to do that and share it with us. If you're in the DC area, please also type in where you're from. Sometimes I think we let people just from far away do that. I see many people are typing in where you're from, Minnesota, Tempe, Arizona, Spokane, and of course, Capitol Hill and Bethesda. Please answer and take a moment if you will, because we really do want to look at this and get a sense of the breadth of places people are from. The second thing you can do is we have a little poll we want to take just for a moment. You see it popping up on your screen. if you could respond to this, and again, if everyone would respond, it'd be very helpful to us. Where do you live? Do you live in the DMV? And no, that's not Department of Motor Vehicles. For us in this part of the country, that means the District, Maryland, and Virginia. Do you live in one of those places? Do you live relatively close, within a few hundred miles of Washington along the eastern seaboard, maybe out towards the Midwest and a little into the South? Or are you further than that? Are you more than what you think is 500 miles away? I see people answering the polls. Continue to do that, if you will. It's, again, very helpful for us to see this. And it's interesting to note that a third of you so far who have answered are more than 500 miles away from Washington, D.C. So we really do span the country. We have people from all over certainly the lower 48 states, as well as, of course, you see many people, particularly from Maryland and Virginia, and some in the district. So thank you for that. That's very helpful. We'll be looking at this. It helps us as we think about programs. And I'm not terribly surprised, but a little surprised so many of you are from so far away. But that's why we wanted to take the poll and learn about that. So thank you very much. You can continue to type in where you're from if you want, so we can review that later. Now, the McClendon Scholar Program, as many of you know, is now in our 16th year of sponsoring public presentations, webinars, sermons, lectures that feature Christian thought leaders addressing key issues of the day. Climate change and the climate crisis is a relatively new topic for us, but now this is the third scholar we have hosted in the past 3 years that focused on this crucial topic. We had a previous presentation from Corinna Gore at the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and a wonderful presentation from Dr. Catherine Hayhoe from Texas Tech University a little over a year ago. So once again, we return to that topic, and we are delighted to have Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock here for this presentation and discussion. In a moment, I'm going to invite Sarah again to introduce her to you. After she speaks, after Dr. Brock speaks, we'll have a brief response from Joshua Long, who is the congregational organizer for Interfaith Power and Light in the greater Washington area, or the DMV. Interfaith Power and Light is an active and very important network of congregations across the country that work on the climate crisis. And we'll tell you more about them a little later in the program and how you can be in touch with them if you want. Joshua Long is a recent graduate from Wellesley Theological Seminary, where he focused on public theology. He's also a musician who studied how sacred music can help build communities of hope and justice. And now he works for IPL closely with congregations in the greater Washington area to help them get more effectively involved on climate issues. After Josh talks with Dr. Brock and they engage in a conversation, we'll have a little time. We're not sure quite how much, but I think some time to take questions from those of you who've tuned in. If you do have a question, be sure to type it in as Dr. Brock is speaking, or as Josh and she are in conversation. Type it into the Q&A, not the chat. Save the chat for comments and information you've been sharing about where you are. But type it into Q&A, be as succinct as you possibly can be about the question, and I'll be monitoring the questions, and I'll pick some, and we'll go over as many as we can, given time limitations near the end of the program. At the end of the question period, we'll invite Dr. Brock to make some brief final comments, and then we'll share some information about how you can learn more about her work and how you can get involved in this issue with Interfaith Power and Light, and learn more about this type of work with congregations if you're interested in doing so. So again, we're delighted to have you with us. And now I want to invite Reverend Sarah Johnson to come on again and introduce Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock.
Thank you, Theo. As Theo mentioned, I have the great privilege of formally introducing Dr. Brock to you all tonight. Her formal bio doesn't begin to cover the depth and breadth of her influence, but I hope it will give you a small glimpse into the scope of her work and the way that she has impacted both the church and the academy throughout her career. As I mentioned in tonight's opening, she is a minister, a leader, and a theologian who has served as senior vice president for the moral injury programs at the Volunteers of America since 2017. Dr. Brock has over 16 years of experience as a chaplain and 25 years of experience as a professor, including she has held the endowed chair in the humanities at Hamline University, directed the fellowship program at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, and served as a fellow at the Harvard Divinity School for Values and Public Life. From 2006 to 2008, she was the senior editor in religion at the New Press and held a research fellowship from 2002 to 2012 at the Graduate Theological Union Starr King School for the Ministry. In 2012, she co-founded the Soul Repair Center at Bright Divinity School at TCU, which she did direct until 2017. She is an award-winning author. She co-authored one of the first books on moral injury, Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, and her 2008 book with Rebecca Parker, Saving Paradise, How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire, was selected as one of the year's best books in religion by Publishers Weekly, and was a finalist for the American Academy of Religion Award in Constructive and Reflective Studies. In 2017, she led the creation of VOA's successful evidence-based moral injury recovery program for military veterans, using peer-facilitated groups called Resilience Strength Training, which was pilot tested from 2017 to 2019 with a grant from Bristol-Myers Squibb. In 2020, elements of this successful pilot were used to create an online hour-long moral distress processing program that is open to the public. Dr. Brock's topic for us tonight is moral injury and climate change, reclaiming our love for the earth. Dr. Brock, what a privilege it is to have you with us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you. It's interesting that so many people have spoken on climate change. This is really my first run at connecting it to moral injury. I've been thinking about it for some time, but this is the first time I've really struggled with how to talk about moral injury in relation to climate change. And this journey began when the pandemic hit, and I had been mostly working on moral injury with military veterans, and we realized that the pandemic was going to be a thing that would produce moral injury in widespread places, not just in healthcare, but anybody touched by it. And so as I began to think about its impacts, I began to think about how wars and things like that are caused by human behavior. But generally, we've referred to hurricanes and earthquakes and fires and floods and things like that as acts of God. And I think what's happened with climate change is that sense that there's really nothing we can do and these things just seem to happen. And if you're theological, you might decide, well, it's God's retribution for something. I know some people have talked about hurricanes that way. But actually now we're beginning to realize that, well, yes, there are these things that happen on the earth, but it seems as though human beings are also now part of the problem with these disasters. And what does that mean in terms of our own moral responsibility for having gotten to this place, even when we weren't individually causing these things? There's some weight of human life and activity and the benefits of modern society that are now no longer causing acts of God, but causing acts of climate change, which has human participation in it. So that's sort of how I started to think about this, and how the moral injury that results from climate change might be similar to, but also different from how it's been spoken about in the military context or even in the healthcare context. So that's sort of what I'm taking a stab at today. And I'm going to start with a PowerPoint. And what I'm going to do is explore what moral injury can teach us in relation to the way we think theologically about life. So for those of you that are curious about the image behind me, it's in the chat, is painting by a surrealist painter named Philip Singer, whom I discovered in Alexandria, Virginia, when I lived there at one of the art festivals. And I fell in love with his work. And this is from his website, this picture. So I'm going to share my screen now because I do have a PowerPoint. Okay, so the theological part of this talk is largely drawn from work and research I did for my 2008 book, Saving Paradise. The title you see on the book cover, How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire, is a rather gummy subtitle that the publisher wanted us to use the word empire somewhere in the title of the book, because books at that time were being written a lot on empire. But our preferred subtitle actually was the title of the UK Canterbury Press version of this book. So the title of this talk, Moral Injury and Climate Change, the subtitle, Reclaiming Our Love for This Earth, was actually the subtitle we wanted for our book in the first place. That's just a little side note about how about the book itself. The contents are the same, but really the book was about reclaiming our love for this earth. So I'm going to talk about what I think the relationship of moral injury is to climate change. And then I'm going to talk about first millennium Christianity, excuse me, that the great historian of late antiquity, Peter Brown, refers to this early form of Christianity that dominated Christian thought for 1,000 years, the first millennium. He describes as a life-affirming, optimistic, this worldly faith. And I added community-based. And that's often startling to people. What? And so I'm going to explain why that's so. What was the theology that was life-affirming, optimistic, community-based, and this worldly? And then I'm going to explain how a major shift in Western Europe happened over several centuries to the point that the West began to sanctify imperial violence, which is what the crucifixion is, and how it shifted salvation to a post-mortem promise rather than something that was actually made real in this life. It was something awaited. And then I'm going to talk about what I think are some of the morally injurious consequences of crucifixion-based faith and how we might recover or reclaim our love for this earth. So moral injury. Let's start with moral injury, and I'll explain what moral injury is. Moral conflict is an ordinary human experience. If you're a moral human being, you probably had a few. It's when you do something or someone does something to you that's harmful. It may not be seriously harmful, but it causes you discomfort. Things don't feel right. So you might apologize or try to make recompense, or someone might apologize to you and try to make recompense. And that is how we maintain relationships of love and care in our lives, is we deal with what is a conscience-based, ordinary, post-harm stress response. And I don't know that we have these every day, but they're common. So let me go back. They're common. And then there's moral distress, which is an order of severity of moral discomfort that comes when the moral failure, the moral problem that you're bothered by, isn't easy to solve. It may not be clear what the right thing to do is to fix a situation. It might be the conditions of your life don't make it possible for you to make recompense or to do what you need to do to resolve and retain the relationships you have. There could be a lot of reasons why the harm lingers. And so you may begin to worry about it, or you may lose sleep about it, or it just may sort of sit there and come back at quiet times to haunt you, and you're wondering about it. And it can maybe even interfere with your daily functioning some if you lose sleep about it. And most of us probably have had that experience as well. It certainly is a common experience. And then there's moral injury, which happens sometimes because the levels of moral distress become acute. You may have a number of things happening. And I think for a lot of people, the pandemic was like that, where it was relentless and it wouldn't stop. And so it can accumulate, or you can have a cataclysmic kind of harm happen that actually causes you to doubt your own identity, or doubt others, to lose trust in them. This keeps moving. Lose trust in others, and break your relationships, and even cause you to lose your meaning system, to lose your faith, or to give up on what you thought was your life purpose and mission and meaning. And that's a serious crisis. Often moral injury has two interrelated factors that emerge when you become aware of a violation of core moral values. That's when the morally injurious thing begins to happen: moral discomfort, moral distress, moral injury. You become aware of a violation, and it can happen because you transgress what you know is right and fail to prevent, or become a witness to irreversible harm. Or you might be subjected to serious harm by the failures or immorality of persons in power or of systems of power. And that's when you might feel betrayed and helpless and angry about moral failures. And if it's cataclysmic, if it's somebody close to you, you trust that it can really lead to moral injury, and you begin to doubt your identity and sense of meaning. So moral injury is a serious kind of suffering, a moral suffering, but it's a response to harm. And it's an ordinary response to harm. It is not a mental health disorder. It is related to trauma and PTSD, and it's important to know that because often they all three are clustered around an incident. So that trauma is something that's an overwhelmingly harmful event that can be actual or even threatened. It can even cause trauma. And it has a lingering impact because of the intense emotional response you have during the event. PTSD is one dimension that can happen often with trauma, which is that your fear system is in overdrive because it was a terrifying life threat, and the fear system can't calm down. So it is a kind of disorder because your fear system is causing you to respond to reality inappropriately. You may be frightened or triggered by things that don't bother anyone else, or you may have nightmares and flashbacks and be unable to function. And there are good treatments for it. So the things like trauma and psychological disorders have diagnosis and protocols for help with the symptoms and the distorted relationship to reality. Moral injury is not those things, but you can actually also have moral injury and have PTSD and trauma. And moral injury is a response of conscience to moral violations that may or may not involve trauma or PTSD. It's simply that your conscience is afflicting you deeply. It involves painful moral emotions, which are not fear emotions, but rather moral emotions that come after a harmful experience. And it's an appropriate moral response to serious harm. But moral injury can impede mental health treatments because you're miserable. So in any case, moral injury has feelings that are intense, that have to do with toxic fury, violence, a sense of despair, often it leads to cynicism, denial, or even suicidality if it isn't addressed. The difficulty in addressing moral injury is that recovery begins from actually accepting the moral feelings and harm, accepting the thing that happened or the things that happened that have led to the moral injury response of conscience, that this is all true and valid experience. And I think that's especially important to understand with climate change. We are not making this up out of our minds. This is not a disorder. There really are terrible things happening in the world. So that 85% of the world's population has experienced extreme climate events. And half the US population this year has been affected by extreme climate events. And so I think the response of moral injury we have can differ quite a lot depending on how climate change is impacting us. If we have lost our homes, our cities, even our towns, and are destitute because of climate change, it's an acute sense of harm that's happened to us. That's a different experience of where we are with moral injury than if we haven't been especially directly affected, but we deeply feel, as witnesses to the harm, we deeply feel the impact of climate change, knowing that actually there's no single thing that any individual can do, that it's really going to take collective action. And there was a recent article in March of this year in the medical journal Lancet that said that the problem of climate change and the way people are feeling about it, and there's a lot of people, especially young people, feeling a sense of despair about their own futures because of it, that the appropriate term for how people are experiencing the devastations of climate change, that the best term for it is moral injury, which I found surprising in a medical journal, but I agree with that. That moral injury is a complex moral response, and it can involve feelings of helplessness, and it can also involve feelings of a sense of responsibility, and even guilt or shame about it. The issue with moral injury is that it's socially isolating, and to recover from it really means reestablishing relationships. It's important to understand that with moral injury, people have moral meaning systems that collapse, that have difficulty coping with what's going on. And so that is an important dimension of moral injury, is looking at one's own moral orienting system. And moral orienting systems are acquired, gradually from the time we're born. Often unconsciously, we just learn from habit and ritual, and other ways of repetition how to be good and moral, because we need love. And how we are moral is specific to the culture we're in and the language systems that are used and how they organize relationships and communities. And moral orienting systems filter reality. Our perception systems take in so much all the time that the possibilities of seeing reality as it is impossible. There's too much of it. And so our moral orienting system is the sieve or the filter through which we can create coherence from all of that stimuli. So our moral orienting system guides what we perceive as important and remember. It shapes our attention. It also shapes and evokes our feelings that attach to memory, because that's what our perception system takes in and then turns into memory. And most of the time, our moral orienting system operates without our thinking about it. We don't have to think about it. We're mostly moral by habit. And we only really have to think about ethics or moral questions when we don't know what to do, or we face something that it can't handle. And so our moral systems can also be changed by training, experience, circumstances, or even by osmosis. If you land in a different culture and live there a while, by osmosis, you begin to change some of your behaviors. And I think one of the most effective systems our society has for changing people's moral orienting systems is the military. They can do that in 9 to 12 weeks. They can take an ordinary high school graduate and make them part of a military squad that will die for each other. It's a pretty amazing moral shift. And so moral orienting systems guide our relationships, our behavior, our way of seeing reality and where we think human beings fit into it. And the final part of our moral orienting system are the ideas, the conscious thoughts about reality and philosophy and ethics that we use when we're thinking about what should we do or what do I think about the meaning of life. But really, a lot of it is like an iceberg. The stuff below the surface is really a deep part of our moral orienting system. Next slide, please. So what we cherish, protect, and risk our lives for is what we most love. That is really what a moral orienting system is supposed to do. So what we implicitly feel about ourselves and reality, and how we explicitly believe, and what we explicitly believe about salvation and earthly life, matter for dealing with moral injury and climate change. And I think that what I want to talk about now is how we have a theology that can actually deeply love the earth. Next slide, please. This is an early Christian moral orienting system. This is a quote from the 2nd century Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, who was replaced a martyred bishop and was martyred himself. He says, the church is planted as a paradise in this world. And in this world is a world in 1st century Palestine and in the time of Irenaeus, where systems of imperial power were rampant. And Rome had wars on its frontiers. It had imperial surrogates like Herod to control internal uprisings in its empire, but it was constantly warring. There were physical and psychological threats, malnutrition, all kinds of diseases we now know cures for, psychoses, they called it demon possession, and cycles of plague. We're not the first we're not the first people to experience a massive plague. There were cycles of it. Life expectancy at that time was 22 to 30 years. Child mortality was 50%. Adult mortality by the age of 50 was 50%, and only 10% of the people lived beyond the age of 50. So life was short. It was threatened by all kinds of things. There were also many competing religious systems. There were the deities of Rome, Greece, and Egypt. There was Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and all kinds of new religions like Mithraism and Christianity that emerged in this period. There was climate change. The cedars of Lebanon that we hear so much about in the Bible, about the 1107, they were gone. So there was deforestation happening. There was some desertification happening because of over-agriculture and irrigation. So there was also climate change then. And there were episodes of persecution and martyrdom. The church, we know of the famous persecutions. Actually, most of them were localized until the great Diocletian empire-wide persecution of Christians in the year 306. And so there were many martyrs. And the word martyr means witness. So it doesn't mean that if a person was a martyr, they actually died, although many of them did. But you were a martyr if you stood up for the faith and risked your life for it. You were that committed to it, and you were a model for that kind of commitment to your faith. And in that period, before even the 2nd century, Jerusalem in the year 70, had been leveled to the ground. Jews had been forbidden to return on the penalty of death, and they built a pagan city on top of it. So it isn't like Irenaeus, when he says the church is planted as a paradise in this world, lived in a world that was happy and uneventful. It was an awful time in many ways. Next slide, please. But somehow Christians thought that they lived in a paradise in this world. And this is an icon, an image from one of the most important churches in early Christendom. It's the Archbasilica of St. John the Lateran in Rome. It was given to the church as a palace by Constantine when he conquered the empire. And the image that I'm going to show you is a layered image because this church was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Parts of it were rebuilt multiple times. It's a mosaic. This is the apse, and that image was rebuilt multiple times as the church was renovated. But the art historians believe that some of the iconography in this image goes all the way back to the time of Constantine, and then most of it was finished around the 14th century. So this is a close-up of that apse. And I want to describe to you the cosmology here, the world that Christians meant when they described the church as a paradise in this world. So the upper blue semicircle up there is the blue heavens, the mysterious realm of God, where the heavenly beings like the angels and the seraphim and all the resurrected saints in glory live up there with Jesus, who was resurrected as the Christ. And so that is an old iconography. The red, white, and blue clouds are puffy little things in the blue night sky. And that the blue night sky is a sense of the mystery of God. And then coming down from that blue area, there's this dove. It looks like a little cross there, but that's a dove dropping down from that blue circle, spewing from its mouth. You could see the mouth there's a spewing of water. And that water is spewing on top of a golden jeweled cross and making a pool at the bottom of the cross. And then at the bottom of the cross, you see what look like 4 big gray roots going into a green field with sheep and deer and meadows, and then you have all these saints. So the human figures there were probably added in the 12th century because St. Francis of Assisi is one of them. But it's also true that there may be older ones, because if you look from the left to the right, you will see Paul and Peter and Mary, and then on the other side of the cross, John the Baptist, John the Evangelist, and Andrew. So those are apostles and biblical characters. And then you have St. Francis and some local, like a emperor and some other smaller figures. It's not clear what was added when, but that cross is a very old iconography. And you can see those roots. Well, I've actually seen this with binoculars in Rome. You have to actually go behind a big medieval altar to see it, but you can see it. Those rivers have gold letters that identify them with the words Gihon, Pishon, Euphrates, Tigris. So anybody who knows their Genesis 2 knows that those 4 names are the names of the 4 rivers that come from paradise. So this is not a picture of roots. It's a picture of the waters of heaven coming down into a pool, into those rivers of paradise. And in the middle of that golden jewel cross, I'll show you in a minute, it's the next slide, there's a really interesting image. But those rivers come down. If you go back to the original, I'm going to finish this. They go down into the green meadows of paradise, those 4 rivers, and then they go and they flow into the bottom river. That strip along the bottom is a river, and it's labeled the Jordan. So there's this kind of hydraulics of salvation going on here, where the water comes down from heaven, it flows from the great river of paradise into the 4 and back into the great river. And the great river of paradise was identified in ancient times as the River Jordan. And the 4, they didn't know what the Gihon and Pishon were, but everybody knew the Euphrates and Tigris. And some of the guesses about the other 2 rivers are kind of interesting. Some of them even think it's the North Pole was one of the rivers, that something came from the Arctic, and some guessed the Nile, the Danube. And so there were different guesses, but everybody knew the Tigris and Euphrates. And so in that river below are cherubs, as it were, enjoying the waters. There's one that's riding a swan, a couple are fishing and riding in boats, and there's even one that's windsurfing. And on the left side, you see a cherub with a pitcher that's pouring the waters of the Jordan into the river. So they actually would depict the Jordan as a river god, as a kind of symbol of power that river had. And so this is this image of what the waters mean is baptism. So the next slide, please. And you can see this old iconography of that jeweled cross. This image from the 5th century is the oldest existing image of a cross in a church, and it's in Rome. And you can see that sense of it being a jeweled resurrection-oriented cross over Jesus's head there. He's there teaching the apostles in the College of the Apostles. It's the very oldest image of him. He's sitting on a divine throne. Next slide, please. But there you see, there's the dove. I want to show you the dove. And at the very bottom, I said there was this interesting image in the middle of that cross. That's an image of John the Baptist baptizing Jesus in the River Jordan. So the understanding was that when John baptized Jesus in the river, he left that dove spirit of water, of baptism, he left that spirit in the river so that anyone baptized in any water on earth received the same divine spirit that Jesus had, and he left in the water for the rest of us to have when we were baptized. And so that's a baptism cross. It's a cross, as I said, the hydraulics of salvation. It's the cross of baptism, and this church was so important as a site for baptism that pilgrims would come just to be baptized there. And Charlemagne even had his sons baptized there in the year 800, near the time of 800. But the other thing I wanted to show you in this image is if you look above that dove into the clouds, they look sort of gray here, but in the clouds, you see a slight break in the clouds right in the center, right over the dove. There's like a break and then another little cloud and then the dove. That little thing there, if you had a close-up of it, would look a lot like what you see in the other image, which is the hand of God blessing, sending down a blessing. And in ancient art, the only way you see God is his hand. This hand that hangs down and blesses the world. The one on the other picture is of Moses from the 5th century. This is the hand of God reaching down to Moses to tell him to take off his sandals, his shoes, because there's a bush right there burning at where his toe is pointing as he's untying his sandal. And as you notice, all the bushes are ablaze in this image. So the Spirit of God is everywhere, even if Moses can only see it in one of the bushes. So there's this sense when that hand is there, that this is a blessing from the heavens coming down that had been sent. And so what I would say in terms of how this imagery works is salvation is not temporal. It is not something that you receive that then you are waiting for, but rather it's vertical. It's a blessing that comes down and transforms people, transforms reality, transforms everything with the Spirit of God alive in the world and in human beings. Next slide, please. So at the bottom, I just wanted to show you a close-up of the bottom of this because I think it's so lovely. You can see the little cherubs there enjoying the waters. So there's this delightful sense in this imagery of just pleasure, of joy, of enjoying the blessings and beauties of the earth. And under the 4 rivers there, you see what is a golden city with a saint and his arms raised in the position of prayer. The raised arms were how people prayed. And above him is a palm tree and a peacock, which are symbols of everlasting life. And on either side are sheep drinking from the rivers. When you see sheep in ancient art, they're almost always apostles because Jesus was first depicted as a shepherd. So there are often 12 sheep around him. The sheep are apostles, and the deer above are a reference to the psalm in which it says, "A deer, my heart longs for you, O God, the way a deer longs for water." So that sense, the deer are actually images of human beings hungering for the Spirit of God, drinking from the waters of paradise. And their flowers, it's just a beautiful image. If you're ever in Rome, go and see it. It's just a gorgeous image. Next slide, please. So this is what Ephraim of Syria says. He is this is an interesting figure in the early church. He was a poet, a teacher, an intellectual, a lay ascetic. The Eastern Orthodox Church still calls him the songbird of paradise. He was persecuted. He was born during the Diocletian persecution. His hometown was on the border between Persia and Rome. And so it kept changing hands, and there were sieges and famines, and he eventually had to relocate to Edessa in Turkey. And so he had not what you would call a peaceful, comfortable life. But his sense of what it meant, the church as the paradise in this world, is the sense of how we are all connected by that spirit we receive at baptism to journey in perfection of love. And that this kind of perfection of love was a circulating process. It wasn't something one possessed it as a virtue, but one enacted. And the community of the church gave everyone an opportunity to contribute. So he says, one person falls sick, and so another can visit and help him. One person starves, and so another can provide him with food and give him life. One person does something stupid, but he can be instructed by another and thereby grow. In this way, the world can recover. Tens of thousands of hidden ways are to be found, ready to assist us. So everyone can contribute, and everyone is obligated to contribute in the uplifting and maintenance of a paradise in this world. Next slide, please. So what we found interesting in our research, which we didn't believe at first until we started to really research this, that the crucifixion of Jesus is just not shown in ancient art. It's just not there. In the first sequence of the life of Jesus in a church in the 5th century in Ravenna, the Passion story actually moves from Simon of Cyrene carrying Jesus' cross to an image of the resurrection. They just don't even show the crucifixion. But this is about the same era. And this is a little tiny ivory box, a casket that they don't know what was in it, but this was carved on the outside in ivory. And this does show the Passion narrative. And it starts with Pilate up in the upper left corner, washing his hands, and then Jesus carrying his cross. And then Peter and the cock crowing. So you have the denial of Peter there. Then you have, and this is the interesting thing, in the upper right panel, what is called a crucifixion. And I think my image on my phone anyway is blocking it, but I hope you can see it, because the dead person in that picture of Jesus's crucifixion, the dead person is Judas hanging from the tree. Jesus is not dead. His eyes are wide open and he's looking at you. So one art historian that really looked at that image said that when Jesus is depicted on the cross in the ancient church, which is rare, he's not dead. He has defeated death. He is not the suffering dead Jesus we're so used to seeing. No, he is already on his way to eternal life in some way. And so you have Mary and John, and you have on the other side the Roman whose lances pierced Jesus's side. But the next image then immediately is the resurrection, and you see the Roman soldiers have fallen away, drunk or sleeping or astounded. And you have the two women at the tomb, and the tomb door is open. Part of it's been broken, and you can see an empty sepulcher inside. And then on the door are carved the image of the raising of Lazarus and the image of the woman up on the right. She's also on the door, is an image of lamentation, of sorrow. So there's a sort of commentary there, or echo in the biblical stories around Jesus's resurrection. And then there is Jesus teaching the apostles, and you see Thomas sticking his finger in his side. So those are resurrection stories from the Gospels, and they're there. And that's the story of the Passion. Focus is on defeat of death and resurrection. Next slide, please. It's a little more close up. There you can see Jesus looking pretty robust and unwounded, and certainly wide open-eyed and not dead. And the contrast with Judas, who betrayed him, is marked. It's very clear. And one of the reasons people think that the early church never showed Jesus dead was that Roman art would show their enemies who were vanquished, dead and suffering and dying. And so they weren't about to show Jesus like that because he was not defeated by Rome. And there's the image of the resurrection again with the door. It's a little hard to see, but I've seen this in the British Museum. You could see it there. And there's Lazarus being raised in the bottom. There's the woman lamenting. Next slide, please. So this is another rare example of a so-called crucifixion image on the upper high panel of a door at Santa Sabina in Rome. And again, I've looked at this. It's very interesting. There are no crosses in that image. If you look carefully, they're missing. Sort of what there looks like blocks on the three figures' hands, but not really crosses. And if you look at the upper right, it's the same posture as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were saved from the fiery furnace. So you have rescue from imperial violence in that image of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I love their outfits because Rome's worst enemy was Persia, and they hated the Persians. This is vicious hatred of the Persians in Rome. So the Christians in the catacombs, this is an image from the catacombs, the Christians in the catacombs depicted Daniel and the three youths and people who were escaping, and the Magi and people who were escaping from imperial violence in Persian clothing. So the poofy hats, the pantaloons, the fluffy tresses of hair under the hats, all of that is Persian dress, not Roman. Roman men didn't dress like that. So I think that's very interesting, just a little political detail about a fashion statement. But then you have this image where the three figures on the door that are supposed to be the crucifixion, number one, there's no crosses there. And number two, their posture and the way they're arranged look a lot like the image of the three youths in the fiery furnace from the catacombs from 100 years before. So it's whatever that image is, it's not a sad image of Jesus dying and suffering. Next slide, please. So here's what I think some of the work of this art means. And the reason we chose to study the art is, of course, nobody read the Bible in those days except the bishops that had one in the church. Their books or manuscripts were extremely expensive and had to be written by hand. And there wasn't a clear organized Bible for several centuries in early Christianity. And there were different manuscripts circulating. So the images, as people went to church, the images taught the faith along with the oral traditions of the story and the preaching, not from them reading biblical texts. And so I think here's what the theological meaning of all of this paradise art, victory over death art is saying, is that Jesus is the prototype of humanity to be imitated in the journey to theosis. This is still an Eastern Orthodox tradition. Eastern Orthodoxy didn't have the same theological shift as the West did. And by theosis, they mean the journey together of a community with the Spirit of God in them, working together to live out that spirit of love and justice as fully as possible. And in that process, humanity exemplifies the same divinity that Jesus had. So Jesus's divinity is not exclusive and only his, but rather God became human in Jesus so that we as humanity might learn how to become divine. And that is a very different theology from the idea of original sin in the West, that we had this possibility in our bodies, in our flesh, in our capacity to love, to be fully inspirited with the Spirit of God in us, and that Jesus is the prototype to be imitated. That overcoming the imperial powers of violence and destruction was what the resurrection of Jesus affirmed. So Jesus is not focused on as crucified, but rather as reborn, as resurrected, as having the spirit of life. And they in the ancient church, and this is not an uncommon belief in the world, the ancient church believed that the dead didn't disappear when they died. They passed through a thin veil of death where Satan and the serpent and all the suffering of the world couldn't get through the thin veil. So they got to rest in another neighborhood of paradise, sort of like you work all your life in New York and then you get to go to a gated community in a nice warm place. I used to say Florida, but now Florida has so much climate change happening. I don't know if Florida's a place people want to go, but just that you get to rest. And so they believe that the dead rested and visited the living to provide spiritual comfort, so that Jesus, as the risen Christ, hosted every Eucharist, visited churches, visited everybody. He was available because he was resurrected. And so how one is rescued from danger and death is through resistance to the powers of violence and death and prayer. That open-hearted, open-armed thing called the orant is the position that people prayed in. They didn't bow like this. They prayed open arm and glorious. And the betrayal appears to me to have been the greatest sin. Betrayal of the Spirit of God, betrayal of the community of paradise, betrayal of Jesus. So in the 13 scenes in this 5th century church of the Passion narrative that's missing the crucifixion has 5 panels of the 8 devoted to betrayal, which I think is very interesting. And it's in the words of Paul in Corinthians on the night that Jesus was betrayed. So betrayal is a serious problem. And of course, in the image of Judas, leads to death without that sense of resurrection. So one of the things that was preached was that the resurrection of Jesus, because he says to the thief, today you will be with me in paradise, that his resurrection opened the doors of paradise in this world for everyone in this world. They just had to figure out how to walk through the doors. And baptism was how you walk through the doors. So death was this thin veil. And what this means, I think, is that salvation was not temporal. In other words, dying wasn't what you waited for so you could get to paradise. You just changed neighborhoods, but you got paradise as soon as you were baptized. And so salvation was, as I said, vertical and spatial, rather than something that you kept hoping for, moving for, anticipating. But really, you had to live into what it was that was already handed to you and make it flourish. So as baptism was entry into earthly paradise, as the church and begin the process of theosis, which was to maintain that sense of paradise. And so Eucharist was a feast of abundant life hosted by the risen Christ. And the risen Christ hosted everybody's Eucharist. He was really busy. So even Augustine, when we think of as the sort of morose sex addict sometimes, he's so worried about original sin and desire and things, he says, paradise is the church, as it is called in the Song of Songs. The 4 rivers of paradise, the 4 gospels, the fruit trees, the saints, and the fruit their work. The tree of life is the Holy of Holies. Christ, the tree of knowledge and good, Christ is the Holy of Holies. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the will's free choice. So, and Augustine actually refers to the world as a smiling place. And those parts of Augustine in the West have not been emphasized, but he says, God made the world in Genesis 1, Gan Eden, the garden in Hebrew. God made the garden, Gan Eden, God made the world in creation, and in Genesis 2, God made a garden for human habitation. So we're not supposed to populate the whole planet. We're supposed to stay in our garden, as it were. And that God took the trees, the water, everything from Genesis 1 that was already created to make the garden. Therefore, he says, the whole earth shares in the essential qualities of paradise. The whole earth. And the Greek translation for that Gan Eden is luxurious paradise, and the Latin version in the Vulgate is pleasure paradise. So it is a place of beauty and joy and celebration, as where it is what we have to help flourish and sustain. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go quickly through this. This is what happened to that theology that was so life-affirming and optimistic, is that Charlemagne, the Muslims had invaded the southern part of Europe, and Charlemagne's, I think his grandfather Charles Martel was able to stop them in northern Spain, and then his grandson Charlemagne began to build this Christian empire across southern Europe and push against the Muslim invasions. And he had a problem on his northern border of northern tribes, the Gauls, the Saxons, that they resisted his imperial ambitions. They were democratic tribal cultures, and they didn't like the empire. And so when he went on a terror campaign of conquest to win those tribes over into his empire, and when he pretty much accomplished that, he put his bishops in the churches of the Saxons and these other tribal groups that had that older kind of paradise Christianity. And he had his bishops preach to them that what was on their Eucharist table, because Eucharist was the central ritual, what was on their Eucharist table was not the risen Christ as a host of the table. No, it was the crucified body of Christ, that their sins against him had killed Jesus. And so he actually implied that sinful Christians who took the Eucharist were partaking of the dead body of Christ that they had killed by their sin. And he had his bishops also preaching a fierce terror of hell, that if they didn't repent of their sins of the empire, they would eat and drink damnation at the Eucharist and wind up in hell. So this was contested by the Saxons. They fought it. Their bishops were imprisoned and killed. This was a terror campaign of an ideology that used the threat of violence, the threat of hell, and fear, stirred up fear in order to make people obedient to imperial power. And there was a lot of warfare in Europe. And so Charlemagne calmed a lot of that down with his empire. So in the year 80, the Pope declared him the king of the emperor of the Roman Empire again in the West. So this new theology of the Eucharist, this reintroduction of the dead body of Christ, the crucifixion, is a central moment in this crucial ritual for Christians, started to take hold in Northern Europe. And that's where in 960 you get your very first crucifixion images. But it was contested for 200 years. It eventually was determined by a church council that it was heresy not to believe that the table contained the dead body, the crucified Christ. And Anselm, Archbishop Anselm, who was a friend of Pope Urban II, who launched the first crusade against Jerusalem and the Muslims in Jerusalem, wrote the first book on this theology of crucifixion as salvation. And his book was called Why God Became Human. And he asserts that the only reason that Jesus embodied God in the world was to die, period. His goal was to die for human sin, to resolve, to protect God's honor, because our sin had so insulted God that a penalty had to be paid, and we were too bad to pay it. Therefore, Jesus, who was perfect, had to pay it for us. This is called substitutionary atonement theology. It's interesting because Anselm's treatise is written 2 years after the Pope launched the first crusade and made war a holy act. Some scholars are now arguing that atonement theology emerges as a form, starting with Charlemagne and then in Anselm, as war propaganda to inspire people to fight. And interesting thing about Anselm's work is that he doesn't use the Bible. It's just a rational argument he makes, and he never mentions the resurrection. Resurrection does not compute in his understanding of salvation. Peter Abelard, 20 years after Anselm, asked the question, who will forgive God for killing his own son? He saw the implications of Anselm's theology. But his substitution, his version, because he still had to explain the crucifixion, that was now orthodoxy. His version said, well, it wasn't God that killed Jesus, it's human sin that killed Jesus. And bonding and paying attention to and feeling the deep sorrow that our sin had caused to Jesus, all the horrible suffering he went through to change us to be more loving, that would change our hearts. And this is called the moral influence theory. So in other words, we are sinful, and in witnessing the suffering, witnessing the torture and murder of Jesus, we face our own sinfulness and repent and vow to be loving and sacrificing the way he loved and sacrificed. This is the theology that has been taught to victims of domestic violence and other forms of violence, that if you love as Jesus loved, you will forgive unto death. This is one of the implications of atonement theology, is to make people complicit in their own the violence against them, that kind of betrayal. So there's a way in which it sort of induces and accepts moral injury as an important dimension of faith. Next slide, please. This is the first image of Jesus dead that exists in a cathedral anywhere. There are others that look a lot like it at Dumbarton Oaks. If you're in the DC area, you can go visit their museum. It's called the Garrow Cross. It was made in Northern Europe in 960. And the question that Rebecca Parker and I have about this image, which is an unanswerable question in some ways, is this a picture? Is this a depiction of what the Saxons felt that Charlemagne had done to them? The way that they were asked to think of Jesus, that this is an image of imperial violence inflicted on the Saxons themselves as a devotional image, or is this an image of their accepting and being compliant with the theology of the Roman Eucharist with the dead body on the table? And this is what they were imagining. It's not clear whether it's a dissonant image or a compliant image, but it is a sad image, and he is clearly dead. Next slide, please. And so the images of crucifixion multiply, and you get this, I think, is one of the most extreme images of his suffering, to the point he's hardly human looking. His feet have almost claws like animal claws for nails, and then the nail in his feet. His fingers are distended. His body is covered with thorns. He looks almost diseased. It hung in a plague hospital. It was made for a plague hospital in Colmar, France. And the evangelist John is pointing to Jesus holding his book, the Lamb, open, the Lamb of God. And in case you missed that point, at the bottom near John's feet is a lamb bleeding into a chalice. And then there's Mary with the container of oil on her knees, and the Virgin Mary no longer standing confident and calm with Jesus, but rather fainting away and being held by an apostle. So, and what's interesting is he barely looks human in this image. And then their image of resurrection is also very strange. Next slide, please. This is an early version of an image of resurrection where you find a whole crowd of people around. And this is called the Anastasis, or the rebirth in Istanbul. Jesus is actually lifting Adam and Eve out of their graves as a symbol of all humanity is now being given life by Jesus's rebirth and resurrection, and the doors of paradise have been opened. Next slide, please. This is that Isenheim altar version of resurrection, where Jesus doesn't really look very human at all. and everybody is falling down around him below. Rebecca and I called this Rocket Man Jesus because it's this very, very surreal sort of image of what a resurrection of Jesus might mean when it has no real redemptive value. Next slide, please. And so I want to also compare what happened to the Trinity. This is understood to be one of the earliest versions of a depiction of the Trinity. And it's the three visitors that visited Abraham and Sarah when Sarah's told that she will have a child, and she's laughing in her hut, and Abraham is giving a fatted calf to the three visitors, and they have 3 loaves of bread. This got picked up, this image in this church in Ravenna got picked up as an image of the Trinity. So you can't tell who's Creator, Son, and Holy Spirit. They all look a lot alike, but one of them is the creator of the earth. One of them is Christ who opened the doors of paradise. And the other one is the Holy Spirit. He left in the water so everybody shares. And so the Holy Spirit is the animating divine presence in the church. So next slide, please. On the left, you have an Eastern Orthodox version of that very same tripartite Trinity, all parts equal, and you have to figure out who's pointing what and what's in the dish and everything to figure out which one is the Creator and Jesus and then the Holy Spirit. But again, you have this sense of all of these together, the same and yet separate. And then on the right, you have a Western Trinity. Now that the crucifixion is the focus, you have God holding the dead Jesus as the symbol of salvation for the viewer to admire and to contemplate. And the Holy Spirit's been reduced to that little white thing above Jesus's head, which is a bird. So the Holy Spirit is often missing in Western Trinities. It's just Jesus and God. And so the whole sense of the mission of the church as the Spirit, the third person of the Trinity is the mission of the church, is just absent in Western Christianity. And salvation, of course, in terms of sin and hell, becomes totally individual. It's like you have to get your own salvation and you have to leave everyone else behind that might tempt you not to stay with it. And the inscription in the Trinity, there underneath the image of Jesus on the cross, you see a skeleton stretched out on a platform, and above it is the inscription, "I was what you are, and what I am you shall be." So it's kind of not real optimistic or kind, that image of the Trinity. Next slide, please. And so this is a wholly different sensibility. And I just wanted to show you this because I think it's just a wonderful image. It's in San Vitale. And when you walk in the doors of the church, you see it, but the church is huge. So it's sort of midway down the height of this large octagonal church. And as you approach the chancel, you begin to see this image. Next slide, please. And there it is. This is Jesus sitting on the blue globe of the earth with a codex, a scroll, and a crown. And that crown could be, the way it's done, it could be a wedding veil or it could be a victor's crown. Both of those look like that. And you see angels. He's flanked by angels. He has a couple of saints around him, and then you have that beautiful blue and red sky. I think that golden sky is an Easter morning baptismal sky. That's why it's gold, and it's dawn. That's that color of dawn. This is when people were baptized at dawn at Easter. But that globe sits on the meadows, a bunch. It's like a little mountain, a little mesa there, and there's flowers and green grass, and it's just gorgeous. All this life. And you see at the bottom 4 little rivers. So again, the 4 rivers appear as part of the iconography of the space you're standing in. You are standing in this gorgeous space that is a paradise. And that blue globe is in place of a throne. This is what Jesus sits on. And he looks about 15. He's in his sandals. He looks pretty plain. He doesn't have a lot of imperial garb on him. And this was done in an Arian church. So it may be emphasizing Jesus as the Son of God rather than equal to God. Usually when he's seen as equal to God, he looks more like an older man. So there's a slight theological difference there. But nonetheless, there is Jesus on this blue globe of the earth. Next slide, please. This is another image, and I want to show you something about how your meaning system can shape perception. And you can perceive something that I think isn't really there. So this is in San Clemente in Rome. It's another one of those images that has layers of being fixed and added to and whatever. So they're not sure if Jesus was on the cross originally, but this church went through a lot of changes and things. But you see again Jesus at the top in that blue globe of heaven. You see this bunting. Then you see this little hand of God holding a crown it's actually another one of those crowns like in the other image with Jesus, holding that crown with the hand, that hand of blessing at the top of that sapphire blue cross that has little doves all over it. And Jesus standing there looking at you interrupts the doves. And then the cross rests in almost like a potted plant, and it's acanthus vines that are spiraling out in all directions. And in each of those spirals is activity of life. There are people feeding chickens, a monk writing a codex, people talk sitting. There's just all kinds of life and activity happening in that spiraling vine that goes out from where the cross meets those acanthus vines. And so the next slide, please. That's the bottom where the acanthus vines are. So you can see the bottom there where the doves are just at the top. And then you can see the acanthus leaves. And then you see a little something or other that's framing a little deer there. There's a little deer there grazing at the bottom of those vines. And what looks like a pot, well, it turns out that might be water, because what you see below again are the 4 rivers. And you see the deer drinking from the water, and you see some ibis birds, and you see it's just teeming with life. This beautiful image of, again, the 4 rivers of paradise, and below the river of the Jordan. Next slide, please. And at the top, you see again the hand, as I said, the hand of God is very clearly holding that wreath over that cross with the doves. And I think the doves are kind of interesting. So I want to read you what this Christian scholar, G.K. Chesterton, saw in that image when he looked at it. He is committed to the Western version of the atonement as a kind of theology. Next slide, please. So he said of this is a moral orienting system through the crucifixion, which requires violence to save and create life. And this is an excerpt. It's a very long thing he does. The apse is a half moon of gold on the usual pattern, but at the top, there is a cloud out of which comes the hand of God above the crucifix. It does not merely bless it or even merely rest on it. It seems to take the cross as if by the cross hilt and thrust it like a sword into the earth below. It is impossible to say too much of the fruitful violence of this effect. It is not the normal groping of roots or branches, is more like the blood of the earth spurting instantly from its arteries at the first wound. No one but a madman could stand before it and say that our faith is anti-vital or a creed of death. Next slide. So even a Western Christian had to make that image of paradise turn into an image of some kind of blood being spilled for there to be life to come. And this image of Jesus on the blue globe that I told you about, I actually showed this to a group of scholars, and some of whom were art and religion people. One of them is pretty well versed in Christian art, and he said to me, "Where have you found art historians that talk about these four rivers? Anybody know, like mention what they're doing in this image?" And I said, "No, Rebecca and I couldn't find hardly any references to anything related to the rivers at all. And nobody mentions it in this image." And we found that really puzzling, but maybe it's because they just assumed it had to do with the afterlife of paradise. And it seemed kind of, for modern scholars, kind of embarrassing, this afterlife stuff of paradise. And he said, I've looked at that image hundreds of times myself, and I never noticed the rivers. So what we want to see, what we believe, can shape how we see things in ways that actually might not be accurate to what is there. And so one of our objectives in doing the book Saving Paradise was Rebecca and I wanted to bring a theology forward that would reconnect Christians with the sense that the earth is a gift. This earth is an amazing place. This earth is the place we live our salvation. We're not waiting for it at all. It's our responsibility to live it out here. So I'm just going to end with a little bit from the epilogue of our book, because I know we've killed a lot of time with my crazy computer acting up. So I might have something in there. But anyway, so here's what I want to, just a little bit. Paradise belongs to no one individual, not even to God, who shares it with us all. And we must learn to perceive it and to relate to it with ethical grace. Ethical grace is full-bodied life in the present, tuned to what is beautiful and good, and responsive to legacies of injustice and currents of harm. Sustaining communities must be at the forefront of our work, and we must accept that we have power and responsibility to foster life in them. To be both powerful and responsible requires us to be committed to the sometimes difficult, sometimes joyful relationships of human communities. They are the only way we come to perceive and act upon the world for a greater good that both includes and transcends our individual existence. People with strong commitments to strong communities make them happen. They create the institutional structures that enable communities to endure the comings and goings of individual lives, failures in leadership, and the difficulties that are inevitable in life. Communities of ethical grace sustain relationships that require us to share responsibility, act generously toward one another, and resist oppressive and dominating forces that separate human beings from each other and deny our powers of love and friendship. They value the distinctive gifts of individuals for the good of the whole and require us to be open and vulnerable to the many complex dimensions of life that support the survival and thriving of life on Earth in all its diversity. The arrows of beauty calls to us and bids us be fully in the world, attentive to particularities, emotionally alive, open to grace, and responsive to injustice. Everything belongs to the God of beauty, said Clement of Alexandria. One's response to the gifts of life already given, the beauty already here, makes all the difference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brock. That was wonderful. It was insightful. It was meaningful, and just personally, I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and especially the attention to art and the icons and the images they really not just tell the story, but speak to how Christians in the past saw paradise, and I think they might be able to say a lot to us today, even. So again, just thank you so much. So I have lots of questions.
Okay.
But I'm mindful of time, so I think I'm gonna do maybe one more, the moral injury, and then come back to sort of paradise.
Yeah.
And, the first one I'm thinking about is in terms of your work with moral injury, your work with veterans, which again, first of all, thank you for your service and thank you for doing that deep work. It's really needed. As someone who's been working in climate change for a few years now, I think about the ways that it feels as if we don't have as much agency in this. I know you mentioned moral injury, that it could be either something that we transgress, or that it's something that happens to us. And so I kind of want to hear more about your thoughts of moral injury of the climate crisis as opposed to with veterans. And someone who signs up for the armed, unless they're drafted, someone who signs up for the armed forces is making that sacrifice and has that agency in there, and feels like in the climate crisis we're all complicit in this. So I would love to hear more of your thoughts about that.
Yeah. There are a couple of things. I have come to a sense myself that it's not a bad thing to have a universal service draft. Not necessarily the military, but an expectation that you could commit 2 years of your life to serving the country, the community you belong to for its betterment. So Peace Corps or AmeriCorps, or there are a whole lot of, we need maybe a climate corps, that where people could spend 2 years, because we increasingly live in sort of gated and balkanized, separated communities, and everything's becoming more and more segregated, class-wise especially. And the military and the service is one of the few places where people don't get to choose who they hang out with. And you actually have to confront your own limitations, and you have to confront difference, and you have to be with people in a way that you learn to get along with them because you have a common purpose. And I think that's a good lesson to learn when you're young. And I think if we had that, there's a lot of really important work that could get done with people who would be expected to do that work, and then they would get college for free, or whatever they wanted, job training, they could get it for free. I think that would really change the sense of increasing polarization, isolation, despair. I mean, there's an epidemic of loneliness and depression in the society, especially in young people. And I think it's because their sense of life purpose is missing, and they're facing into a future that looks like everything's going to be shrinking, and they have to stop. This climate change means giving up a whole lot. So I think that that's really important. And I also think that the way you stay morally resilient when you're feeling as miserable as some people do, I feel pretty miserable about climate change myself, is you really need to be with people who understand how you're feeling, and say, yep, it's really that bad, and work together to support each other to stay resilient. Because it's appropriate to feel bad. It isn't really helpful for people to say, oh, you shouldn't feel that bad about it, or you shouldn't. It's not helpful, because the reality is it's bad. And to carry that lightly instead of as a major disempowering burden requires support. It requires empathy. It requires other people who care too, and have ways that they can work together to do even little things that actually make you feel like you're not contributing all the time to the problem, that you can, put your finger in the dike a little bit. And I think it's complicated with climate change because it's not like you individually caused it, but you're part of a huge machinery that's causing it. That's fossil-based culture, right? Fossil fuels based. And so to unwind that, you can't do it by yourself. Buy an electric car, well, there are the minerals there that are blood minerals and the batteries. And so there's no clean way. I think we just have to give up the idea that we could be morally pure about any of this. So we just have to be strategic and smart and collaborative. And continue to stay in touch with each other, because we're going to have down moments and we're going to have devastating things happen, and we have to hold each other. We have to hold each other up. It's the thing, that circle of care that Ephraim describes. Not everybody's going to feel down about the same things. We support each other. We believe each other. We stay with it. I think any of us, I'm now, beyond retirement age. I've been working on anti-racism things. I've been working on all kinds of feminist things from the time I was in college. And what's kept me going is my friends. Now, the Dobbs decision is devastating, but I have friends. We all were devastated together. We're going to keep fighting. So that kind of network is less available to younger people. And I think that's why the depression and loneliness rates are so high. And it's not something you can just do individually to create for yourself. And I think social institutions that help people navigate those things and learn how to have these kinds of friendships where you don't always agree, you may come from very different background, but somehow you find a way to connect and care about people. That's a really important life skill. And I think it's being lost in the ways that we have built society on individual choice. Sometimes sometimes you don't get to choose. You have a duty, do it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. And I a couple of things that you just said in the answer, I'm thinking about is when we talk about climate change and climate solutions, even at Interfaith Power and Light, we encourage, like in your congregation, is you have a green team. Part of that is that community building is actually part of the solution, is part of the creating that resilience. Because yes, we, especially in America, the individualism that we experience will have us thinking that we're alone, we're the only ones dealing with this. I'm the only one. Am I the only one experiencing this climate grief? And no, it's very real. It's the anxiety, depression, and that it's very real. And I'm glad that you acknowledge that. I think, and another part with the seeing the way service creates this community across different lines is also, I think, really important and also really interesting to think about. I want to stay on just on the moral injury because I have one more question about this, and it was actually from looking at your book, Soul Repair. There's a part where you talk about spiritual fitness, sort of like in some of the training of soldiers, that developing spiritual fitness is important as well. But then you challenge some of that also, that sometimes it felt like it was the spiritual fitness was so that one could carry out the mission, one could was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. And so in some ways there's a weird, I guess, cognitive dissonance that develops in that, trying to like find that spiritual fit. And I wonder, as reading it, it made me think of American Western culture, of sort of what the American dream, stands for, of what it means to be a good person, and that you go to school, get an education, get a good job, house and the picket fence and 2 cars in a driveway, and then there are also oppression issues. You should do it while you're white and cis and male, and so it goes all these issues that come
Yeah.
with this idea, and so I think I'm trying to. How do we find a way that like we address this idea of what it means to be a good person, and just suppose with this more collective moral injury of climate change? Like, how do we
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
these feelings? And maybe that's the problem, is that we can't actually, quote unquote, be good.
Yeah. Here's the paradox of moral injury: is life is never perfect, and there's a lot of chaos in the world, and we're gonna have moral conflicts, and they can be devastating enough that they bring us to our knees. The fact that we are capable of having moral injury, of feeling those horrible feelings, is actually a sign our conscience is trying to get through. It is actually a sign of your own goodness that you suffer so much. So being good doesn't get you peace and quiet, and it gets you pain. It gets you struggle. It gets you despair sometimes. It gets you down on your knees because you're a moral person. That's the paradox. And that's why we need to support each other through it. We were critical of that comprehensive soldier fitness thing because it didn't work. The suicide rates kept climbing in the military. And part of it was created by a bunch of positive psychologists that didn't have any evidence base for it. And, and they had things like, write down 3 things you're grateful for every day at the end of the day. And you're in a war zone. It's not a lot to be grateful for. So it asks people not to believe their own experience, but to override it with a sort of mission goal thing. And people do that. I mean, I think people in healthcare for months put aside their grief about all the death and their sense of failure about all the death just to put one foot in front of the other and take care of people, even though they knew they were going to die. So you can do that. People can do these horrible things they have to do because they need to do it. But eventually that will weigh you down. And eventually people hit a wall, and they call it burnout, but it's way more, it's deeper than that. A vacation ain't going to fix it. You can't rest and get over your moral injury. You really have to face into it and process it. And that takes other people who will be on that journey with you because they believe in your goodness.
That was a beautiful answer. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
It actually links to this next question about saving paradise. And I actually have a quote from your book, from the second to last chapter, and it says, "We can come to know the world as paradise when our hearts and souls are reborn through the arduous and tender task of living rightly with one another in the earth. This way of living is not utopian. It does not simply spring from the imagination of a better world, but from a profound embrace of this world." Do you remember writing that?
Yes, I do. I believe that. The world is messed up, but the world is beautiful also. And we keep talking about saving the earth, but the earth isn't dying. The earth just goes through what it goes through. It's got several billion more years to last. It's not clear humans last that long. That's what's at risk. Is our paradise, the place God made for us on the planet that we have wrecked, and the rest of the planet we have wrecked along with it, that it was once the resource for our paradise, is now everything's threatened. And that's on us. But the earth was doing stuff, blowing things up, burning, freezing. The earth just does what it does. And right now its axis is wobbly, evidently, and it's supposed to go into an ice age, and maybe we're preventing that with climate change, but the climate change is swamping the world with oceans. I have no idea around the science of it all, but except that I believe that what we've done with fossil fuels and with the kind of ways that we have chosen to live, we have made life as we know it on the earth precarious, more precarious than it ever has been. So let's see what we can do. The earth just does what it does, and it is, regardless, beautiful in many ways.
Yeah, yeah. I agree with that. And my last question that I have is a little bit twofold. In our work with IPL and in working with people in congregations on forming green teams, electrification, going solar, learning how to speak and talk about climate, and especially advocating both locally and regionally and nationally for climate policies that include environmental justice. It would seem like with your definition of paradise, that is part of the making of paradise, that it's all wrapped up into that. And given all the beautiful ancient art you've shown us, and just me thinking as a musician myself, what are ways that today we could really, reimagine, what paradise could look like, especially considering climate change? Is there ways we could maybe think of in storytelling or art or in our faith spaces that could maybe see an image of a paradise, or see an image of the earth restored in a way that is more positive, and that really pushes back these notions of doom and gloom or escapism theology?
Yeah. It's part of it is that Protestantism was very iconoclastic and didn't like images because they created desire and held you in the world, right? So just you go into some churches and they're little mausoleum, like they're so plain, and just filling spaces with beauty. We do it seasonally sometimes for Advent or whatever. We put some great looking things up, but most of the time churches are very plain places. And I remember this Unitarian church in Berkeley that was up in the hills above the bay, and they had this, from where they were perched, they had this amazing sweeping view of the beautiful San Francisco Bay. I mean, even with all the buildings and everything, it's still an incredibly gorgeous view. And they built their church so there's a concrete wall there. So you have to leave the church and go out into the narthex to the windows in the narthex to see the view, because they want you to pay attention to the sermon and to the words, not to the beauty of the earth. So there's so much about the aesthetic way we think about church that I think we could rethink. And there's so much land, in especially in suburban churches, that could be, instead of lawns, flower gardens, or even food for the neighbors, or there are other ways, or to do plant forests. There's a really interesting food forest movement, which is really fascinating, that people, instead of creating sculptured, like landscape gardens, people are putting plants in that complement each other, that would actually grow edible food, but would be a self-perpetuating place rather than a place that was farmed. Because there was one that was found in Morocco that for 800 years had been feeding 30 villages or something on the edges of it, because they had figured out how to plant things that would grow in the forest. And anyway, so there's that. This is a sort of interesting food forest movement. if I were starting over and buying property, I'd probably want to do that, plant a food forest on my property, things like that. And there's no reason that couldn't be done in lots of spaces. And I know my own town is now paying for trees that people want them on their property by roads and places where it's hot and trees are needed, that they're planting indigenous trees. So there's things like that. But I think we forget how, now that this forest bathing thing is also, people talk about forest bathing because it's so nourishing of your spirit. People don't really understand how nourishing the natural world can actually be, just of your spirit. Just to be outside. And I have a cat that walks on a leash. I take her out an hour in the morning and the hour in the evening, and it just feels so good to be out in natural light that long and just have to pay attention to a creature that's doing her own thing. And I really don't control it very much. It makes my day feel a whole lot better to do those kinds of things. But we need to make sure we do all of these things in ways in our communities where there are neighborhoods where people don't have the resources or aren't understood to be needful of these things, right? I mean, there's a lot of class division in the way our cities are set up, and of course the poorer communities pay the worst economic and environmental price. So I think it's also really important to attend to those things as well.
Thank you both so much. Josh, thanks for some great questions and your presentation, Dr. Brock, and the discussion. We have gone on a little longer than we planned.
I'm sorry about the computer.
To make up for your difficulty with your, and I want to say most people who signed on have stayed with us, even though we've run over, and we do appreciate. We do need to come to a close though, and I want to take just a moment and thank you, Dr. Brock, and I want to share a few kind of quick announcements here. First of all, to hold up some of information on some of your books, which you made reference to tonight, today. These are some books that we urge you all want to explore. Dr. Brock's work, she's talked some from Saving Paradise, and made reference to some other books. Here are two others by her. If you Google her, you can read her about her very innovative work in moral injury and other fields, and recommend these books also to you, and that you might want to spend a little time learning about her work as we go forward. Also want to share with you just very quickly, and as we close here, some information about Interfaith Power and Light. Josh spoke a little bit about the work that they do and how they engage congregations. And you want to know more, you want to get involved. There are two websites here. Interfaith Power and Light has affiliates in 40 different states. So no matter where you are, those 1/3 of you out there who are more than 500 miles away from us, there are alliances in your area. And if you go to interfaithpowerandlight.org, they have a list of that. And if you're in the DMV, then the email is ipldmv.org, and that's how to reach Josh, and he'll get back to you and others there, and about how you can take some of these concerns we're talking about here and direct them towards trying to combat the climate crisis and other challenges that we face. Very quickly, I want to also mention about some additional programs. We will have the weekend of August 19th and 20th, both on Saturday and Sunday programs with Dr. Brock. We will be sending information about that to you on the Saturday program. And you see the title there, The Church's Mission in Moral Injury Recovery, and particularly looking at the power of rituals. And then on Sunday, she'll preach at the worship service at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in downtown Washington. at 10 a.m. That sermon is also available online, as all of our services are available through Zoom calls and through streaming. The other program I want to point to is to get on your calendar, September 20th. We will have a program focusing on how we can respond to men and women who are currently and formerly incarcerated, how we can support them as individuals, as congregations, through organizations we're in. And our speaker will be Anthony Ray Hinton. Some of you may have read his best-selling book, seen him on television. He was 30 years on death row in Alabama for a crime he did not commit. Finally, he was freed by Lawyers from Equal Justice Initiative, who he works with now in 2015. And now he spends his life talking about issues relating to the criminal justice system and how we can support and assist those who are incarcerated, formerly incarcerated. And you'll be hearing more about this, but I want you to go plug out. This will be in person in our sanctuary at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church on Wednesday, September 20th. Information about all our programs it can be found online at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church website, nyapc.org/McClendon-SIR. They're recordings of all of the great scholars we've had over the last several years, as well as information about upcoming programs as they are planned. So we invite you to go there and learn about and see many of the very prominent, well-known speakers we've had on a range of subjects over the past several years. Again, thank you for being with us. As we close, I want to just share as a kind of a benediction, a prayer that I actually got from the Interfaith Power and Light website. They have a lot of really nice resources for people of faith thinking about issues relating to reclaiming the earth and reclaiming our love for the earth. And here is a prayer on the website, a prayer for our earth that actually comes from Pope Francis' encyclical on the earth and on climate change. And here is the prayer as we close. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace us with your tenderness. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. Amen. Again, thank you for your attendance tonight, and we'll be sending out information about a recording on this program to you very soon. Thank you so much.